not going to lie to you and tell you there's no cost for speaking up, right? I'm not going to say that it is necessarily easy, but it's almost always worth it. I think the story that I want to tell right now is about that feeling of holding on to truth when nobody around you believes you. That sense of, something's happening, something bad is coming.
Welcome to How You Find Your Voice, the podcast that asks brilliant women how they found their voice on and off the page.
Yes, this is probably one of the worst experiences you'll ever go through, but you have been forged through this fire, and no one will be able to take that away from you.
I have become obsessed with this whole idea of finding your voice and what it means creatively, personally, and collectively when we find it. I want to understand how you find it, and if you've lost it, how do you get it back? Join me as I talk to fascinating people who have found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. People who have found their purpose, their passion, and fearless, authentic expression. I'm talking about writers, activists, artists, thinkers, entrepreneurs. We're going to get into their work and their life stories. How did they do it? What were the turning points? What barriers did they overcome? How did they find the courage? And what tips and tricks do they have to navigate this business of becoming? I'm looking to reclaim my voice, yes, and to get my mojo back, but it's more than that. I want to understand this topic and look at it from all angles: historical, cultural, societal, biological, mythical, even mystical. And most of all, through a female lens. Let's not beat about the bush, it's mostly women I'll be speaking to, with the occasional brilliant man thrown in. But these conversations are for anyone who resonates with the quest. Everybody's welcome. So, if you want to find your voice or to be inspired, if you're in a liminal state, a similar boat, if you just really like books or want to feast on the sweeping stories of amazing people's life and work, then this podcast might be for you. Please follow, subscribe, and join me on this voyage into voice. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ours along the way. Hello, and welcome to the How You Find Your Voice podcast. My guest today is the author, screenwriter, and award-winning social advocate, Yassmin Abdel-Magied. Born in Sudan and raised in Australia, Yassmin's first job as a teenager was in a coal mine. She later graduated with first-class honours in mechanical engineering and worked as a drilling engineer on oil rigs across Australia, Europe, Asia, and the United States. Since then, she's built an extraordinary writing career spanning memoir, essays, children's books, screenwriting, and now literary fiction. Her first adult novel, At Sea, draws on those years offshore. Set in an oil rig teetering on the brink of disaster, it's a gripping literary thriller about gender, power, and the machismo of big oil, told through the eyes of Zainab, an engineer navigating a world that wasn't built for her. We talk about life on the rigs and the emotional cost of being the only woman in the room. We also discuss public shame, resilience, and finding your voice in hostile environments. I hope you enjoy it. You're here to talk about your debut adult fiction novel, At Sea. It's absolutely brilliant. You're also here to talk about questions around voice and finding your voice, but I wanted to start with your novel first. So it's a tense literary eco-thriller that explores life on an oil rig, condensed into kind of a 3-day period through the eyes of the protagonist, Zainab, as she navigates a male-dominated world. She's been drafted in by her boss, who is a little bit suspicious that things are not all quite what they seem on this oil rig, the Clyde. So she's sent in as a kind of a trusted member of staff to find out what's going on. Why did you want to write this book, and why did you want to write it now?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. So I have experience as somebody who worked on rigs, and it had always struck me that I had never read a novel set in this world, right? I've been enjoying telling people that the only other book set on rigs that I'd read was one called, this is the actual title, Don't Tell My Mum I Work on the Rig. She thinks I'm a piano player in a whorehouse. It was very successful. Yeah, but it was written some time ago. And it's a very particular kind of like, oh, here are all the adventures I had working on the rig. But I had never really read something that was detailed about the life in that well, the kind of ways in which the dynamics play out, and also the very particular experience of being a woman in that environment. Like more generally, as someone who trained as an engineer, I'd never really read that much fiction, and I couldn't find a lot of fiction about being a woman in a male-dominated workplace. So there was that. And also, I am obsessed with technical disasters, right? Like I've always been somebody that's been fascinated by, like, whether it's the Challenger, whether it is an oil spill, whether it is disappearing plane or a plane crash. I'm like fascinated by what happened. Chernobyl, for example, that television show, like what happened? And also, what was it like for the people working in that environment? How did they navigate it? Did they ever think that the thing that would happen? Because what you find out, what you learn, is that technical disasters are almost never technical disasters. They are human disasters. They are human misunderstandings. They're human errors that lead to technical catastrophe. And so this was something that I'd studied a lot in my personal life, but also my professional life. And so when it came to thinking about, okay, what is a story that I want to fictionalize and bring to the page and have as many people as possible read about, I was like, oh, I want to explore what it might be like if you were in an environment where there might be disaster approaching and you have a sense of that and you're trying to do something about it. And what do you come up against? How hard is it to do it? And so those were the sort of the seeds of why I wanted to write this particular book. And it took different forms. Like you described the structure. It's a very tight kind of thriller-like structure over 3 days. But when I first started, there was a version of this novel that was like, I'm going to look at the history of petroleum. I'm going to start when petroleum was discovered. Let me go really big and epic. And that version of that book might one day be written. But actually, I scrapped like 50,000 words, 45,000 words, something like that, because I'd started that version of the book. And then I was like, oh, I'm not sure that this is the story that I want to tell right now. I think the story that I want to tell right now is about that feeling of holding on to truth when nobody around you believes you. That sense of, something's happening, something bad is coming. And yet it feels impossible to make those in power change their behavior to do something about it. And I feel like that's very relevant to the time we're in.
Oh, absolutely. And we see Zainab experiencing that. She's been sort of tipped off, but she also has a kind of intuition, but she doesn't at all times, as you say, feel empowered to be able to do anything about it. And one of the things you just talked about, what do people come up against? Well, one of the things that she really comes up against is she's kind of othered, in the sense she's a woman in a male-dominated world, and we see her sort of grappling to be taken seriously. Some of my favourite aspects of the book were when you go into the real kind of psychological detail and her thought processes before she tries to speak, because we see her really thinking through how best to manage these men, how best to persuade them. Should she go this way? Should she go that way? It's just exhausting. Would you talk a bit about that aspect of the book?
Yeah, it's exhausting. And also it's probably really familiar to a lot of people, a lot of readers. Like, even if you're not somebody working in the very extreme environment of an oil rig, I think so many of us can relate to, okay, I am somebody in an environment where my voice isn't automatically given authority. I'm somebody who's coming up against a particular kind of hierarchy, a particular kind of way of doing things in a particular workplace, even in a family context, right? And you are trying to think about, like, you might call it code switching, you might call it kind of emotional labor, whatever it is, you're doing this work of being like, I have this objective, this outcome. How am I going to make that happen? And I think it felt important to me to really lay out all of that work, right? Because I think also for a character like Zainab, she could be presented as a strong Black woman who's being a boss and just like making her way through it. But actually, in order for her to be that strong Black woman, she has to do all of this work, all of this unseen, invisibilized. And in some ways, she has to make it invisible so that she can even get to where she's going. But yeah, and also some of it was based on my experience, but also some of it was actually based on research. Like, there's fascinating research about how women in male-dominated industries kind of approach navigating that. And there was this one particular study which I found fascinating, which was sometimes the women try to change themselves. Sometimes they'll go into particular kind of archetypes. And so these were things that I threaded through because I was like, this is real. This isn't just a single person's individual experience, but it is actually something that's so common that it's now been studied. And I think for Zainab, maybe what's slightly different about her is that she chooses to deploy different strategies in different moments.
Really?
But for a lot of folks, they choose one strategy and that becomes the strategy that they're going to pick for their career. That becomes an identity rather than just a tactic. Whereas I think Zainab, also partly because of the intersections of various identities, but also maybe because she's trying to be a little bit more effective, is constantly trying to be flexible and adaptable.
Yeah, it was really interesting. You see her different tactics come out with the different really interesting, really well drawn out characters on the rig. So we have some who like roughnecks, like really rough and ready, and they're driven by ego. We have one I thought was really interesting, her interactions with Muhammad, actually, who I think she perhaps sees as a potential ally insofar that they're both Muslim and he addresses her as sister. But then it's almost like because they have this kind of shared identity, he finds it even harder to take her seriously.
Yeah, it's complicated. One of my favorite things to do in this novel is to start with certainty and then complicate and complicate, right?
Yeah.
You start with thinking that this interaction, this dynamic is going to be one thing, and then it becomes complicated. And with Muhammad in particular, it was important actually for me to, again, it was an intentional choice to include this kind of character on the rigs. Firstly, because I think people don't necessarily always appreciate how international rigs can be.
Yeah.
Like this is a very international industry, right? Oil is in lots of different places. And so wherever there is oil, there are oil workers. And so a rig that might be stationed in the North Sea might have Nigerians and Egyptians and Iraqis and Venezuelans and Trinidadians and Brits and Americans. And so you get this really fascinating mix. But what people can find is that if you're the only person from that particular background, for example, like Muhammad has been on this rig, you can exist in a space where the expectations, the kind of cultural expectations that people have of you on shore, on land, on the beach, as they say, you can kind of leave them on the beach, right? You don't actually have to engage with those cultural expectations. The moment somebody from your quote unquote world joins, there's this tension between the cultural expectations of home and the culture of the rig, which is its own world, which is this kind of isolated, bubbled environment. And that tension is tricky to navigate because you're also never going to speak it. You're never going to name it. You're never going to say, this is what's going on here. So everyone's just trying to navigate around this unspoken thing that has emerged. And that's what they're both engaging with. And it also is tricky for Zainab because there are like multiple layers of gendered expectation that she's either trying to play into or subvert with Muhammad. And it's not straightforward at all.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say as well about oil platforms, oil rigs, that they are in international waters, aren't they? And are kind of like a big melting pot. And yeah, you get the sense that Zainab on the rig offshore is quite different to how she is like with her sister or at home. And I found her friendship with Guy really fascinating because there's like a real sort of freedom there. But you often, throughout the book, you hint that they don't know that much about each other's lives and they wouldn't speak to each other. I found that really interesting.
What Zainab finds really attractive about the rigs and the platform, and what some of the other characters do as well, is, as you point out, there's almost this freedom that comes from not ever having to actually tell anyone anything about their personal lives, right? There's this kind of forced proximity and forced intimacy. You're living on top of each other. Your lives depend on each other. But almost as a way of coping with that, you therefore don't reveal anything. You're like incredibly physically intimate, but deeply emotionally unintimate, right? Or like you've sort of almost put everything that exists on land in a box to not be touched or engaged with. And even the moments where, because there's a telephone that everybody has access to, because it's also set in 2004, people don't necessarily have mobile phones or they can't necessarily use their personal phones. And so there's this one phone that everyone has access to, and it's in a main kind of thoroughfare. And so there's also no privacy.
It's like
and
a
everyone
prison.
kind of knows, to be honest, like in that respect. Yeah. that lack of privacy, but almost as a way to respect everybody's privacy. No one asks you anything really about what everybody has heard on the phone. And so for Zainab, the lack of vulnerability, or the fact that she doesn't have to be emotionally vulnerable, in some way gives her some sort of sense of freedom. And again, this might not be healthy at all. I think this is like something that is deeply unresolved for her. But it allowed her, and has allowed her, to kind of live a life where she can be a version of herself and doesn't feel actually like she has to make compromises or has to be a particular person or has to perform in a way that she doesn't want to. There is a sense of agency for her in this world, strangely. And I think that's also a contradiction that I'm really interested in. Why are people making the choices they are to be in this world? What is it about this kind of isolation that people are attracted to? There has to be something. And for Zainab, it was that sense of nobody's going to ask me to be any kind of person.
Yeah, she has a really moving backstory that you kind of unravel over the course of the book. But also she seems to be incredibly practical and sort of gifted mechanically. She feels at home in this very strange technological, mechanical world that seems so alien to someone like me. There's a real sense that she just is soothed by everything sort of working and doing its job. Is that something that you relate to? Because obviously you mentioned earlier that you're a trained engineer as well. As I understand it, your role was quite different to Zainab's and your routine was quite different. But do you share that kind of sense of appreciation and love for the mechanics and engineering that she does?
Yeah, I often joke that I belong in the first industrial revolution because my love is really like gears and grease, you know? I think I definitely share with Zainab the sort of love of old school, large industrial technology. I guess there's something so soothing in the fact that like physics applies and things can work. There can be solutions to everything. There is an order to things. And also, if something doesn't work, you can find a solution. It's not like a social science, or it's not like dealing with humans where there's constant complication and there's constant potential for betrayal. There's always potential for heartbreak. There's always potential that actually they're not being the solution. But for machines, for Zainab, and in some respects for me, there is a peace almost in the idea that there are rules to this world, and no matter what is happening, those rules will always be followed and respected because that's physics. And also it's quite specific around being mechanical engineering or being this kind of mechanical environment because you can see it all. My father's an electrical engineer and we always used to have these cheeky little arguments. And I'm like, you can't even see electricity.
Yeah.
Who is she? Who is she? With mechanics, everything is visible, everything is immediate, everything is in front of your eyes. Okay, maybe you can't see pressure, but you can see gears, you can see the impact straight away. And so I'm thinking of actually two different references. One is an essay that I wrote in the collection talking about a revolution, which is called To All the Cars I've Loved Before. And it's a eulogy to the petrol car because I was reflecting on the fact that I'm probably part of the last generation that will have a relationship to the petrol car, right? The new generation are probably all going to drive EVs. They're not going to know what a carburetor is or the sound of an engine or what the different colors of exhaust mean and so on. It's like I don't have a relationship to horseshoes, right? It's a technology that will be irrelevant. And there's a tragedy in that for me, right? I feel sad about it. And there's also a novel which I haven't read that somebody recommended to me recently, which was called Sky Daddy. I don't know if you've heard of it, which is about a woman who has erotic relationships to planes. I'm curious to see what my response will be. But I guess I wanted to bring to life that relationship between Zainab has a relationship to the natural environment and a respect for the natural environment and also for this kind of beast that is this rig. And she has a lot of affection for it as well. It's a type of anthropomorphization and there's something quite touching in that, I felt.
Yeah, definitely. I get where you're coming from. There's something very comforting about the ideas of like nuts and bolts and surety, things not being subjective, there being answers, there's right or there's wrong and certainty and all of that. And just thinking about what you said about the cars, I mean, we're moving towards the AI era and it's like famously a black box technology. You know, you can't see what's going on. Even the engineers and the people who really know don't really know what's going on. So yeah, I can see that there is like a real appeal. You mentioned your dad there. My dad actually I said to you earlier, is an oil engineer. And I felt like sort of reading this book, I got a kind of a newfound appreciation for what the job entails. He was a platform manager of Statfjord B in the North Sea.
Oh, yeah,
So
in the
he
North Sea. Yeah.
Yeah, between 1983 and 1989.
Wow.
And yeah, I was like reading some of the passages out, and the technical writing that goes into this book is all very accessible and it adds to the tension, I think. It didn't need it translated. Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like it's helped me understand what he did a little bit more as well.
I love that so much. I really love that. I'm so curious what were his reactions when you were reading little bits, if I may ask. What was it like?
Well, actually, because just to show how little I knew about anything, I assumed that his role was the same as Zainab's, but he was explaining that like the platform is different to the kind of the drilling rig, that you have a drilling rig on a platform, but the platform also processes the oil, and there's all sorts of other things as well. And yeah, I guess this was in the 80s, but he was like supporting the idea that he didn't see women in these roles. And he also said it's a really tough job. What she's doing as a tool pusher is really physical. He was like, she has to be really strong. And then you mention it that she's 6 foot tall and she is like really athletic and stuff. So that's one of the things but he's going to be 87 this year. I feel like I was like reading bits out, and it's amazing the technical detail and knowledge he still has, and it allowed him to, I don't know, just explain things to me a little bit. It was interesting. I also asked him about, because you mentioned the Piper Alpha a couple of times.
Well, I was going to say, if he was in the North Sea at that time, it would have been very, very live.
He wasn't offshore when it happened, but he was there like 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
And he said that Statfjord B was like very close. Was it 20 miles or something like that?
Yeah, because it's one of the reason I know the name is because it's one of the names of the platforms that known to be nearby the Piper Alpha.
Yeah.
Gosh. There's another character in the novel who has an experience very close to the Piper Alpha, because she started on the rigs in the late 80s. And so that was like a very live kind of, when I say live, it means it's in people's minds, right? And it was such a tragedy. Over 160 people died. It was really it was foundational to how they rethought safety. But to come back to that, I'm so glad that the book gave you the opportunity to talk to your father about some of this stuff, because to be quite honest, some of this has been about me. Like I now live a life where not a single person that I know or speak to on a day-to-day basis has any concept of what my life was like when I was on the rig, right? And like, frankly, most people who haven't worked in that world won't, because it's not a world you can visit. It's not a world that you see very often. It's not a world that there's much written about. And so it always struck me that I had this entire life that like nobody in my life knew about or knew the details of. Or as you said, people don't even know what you do, right? They're just like, oh, she does something random offshore. She like goes off and comes back, and bit of a black box in that situation. And so I have enjoyed actually hearing from people a little bit like yourselves, because there are a lot of people that work on these environments, right? It's a huge industry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so in a way, it opens up the space for a really interesting conversation, because all of a sudden it allows you to have a type of conversation that you just wouldn't have had an entry point into any other way.
Yes.
And also what's been really interesting for me has been like, will any of the guys that I worked with read this? And what's their take? Because nobody's told me about it yet. No. A few of the guys have hit me up and been like, oh, I saw you wrote this book. One of my kind of like ambitions was to get the book out to an oil rig. And so somebody has sent me a photo. They're like holding the book on a platform, which is really, really cool. But yeah, I think for me, it was also about how do I tell a story that is actually respected by the people who work in that world, while also not trying to flatter anyone. I'm being quite honest about the challenges and what it's like, but I'm also not sugarcoating it. But I'm not trying to judge anyone. I think that felt important as well. I think it would have been easier to have a view on how discrimination, misogyny, harassment, all of that stuff plays out. But I just sort of presented it and presented the ways in which somebody like Zainab navigates that, and was trying to be as honest as possible.
Yeah. I also, I have complicated feelings about oil, because obviously,
of course,
whilst I appreciate what my father did and his job and kind of technical skill and mastery and all that sort of stuff, we do now know that oil is
Yeah.
not exactly great for the environment. But I found it really interesting in this book that you're hinting at the natural world. You talk about the oil rig being a parasite, but there's kind of a lot of nuance and it's not a polemic either. What did you want to say about nature and oil, or did you want to say anything?
Yeah, it's interesting. I really didn't want this book to be a polemic. I like writing in lots of different genres.
Yes, I
And so
noticed.
yeah. And so if I wanted to write a polemic, I think I'd write an essay, or I think I'd write
Yeah.
a manifesto, or something kind of nonfiction, or something much more in the voice of me. And so it was quite intentional, actually, to not have anything like too on the nose about my personal feelings about the industry, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, what I was trying to do was to have the entire kind of narrative operate as a larger metaphor allegory, right? As a larger kind of message around, well, why did this disaster happen, right? Yes, in some ways because of the individual choices of the people on this platform, on this drilling rig, but also because there were incentives for drilling to be as fast as possible, and for people to be done as quickly as possible, and for profit. And actually, there were incentives to look away. And it kind of operates as an allegory for people in the climate movement who are like, look at the data, look at the information, look at what we're trying to say. Why are you not changing your behavior? And also for this broader piece around the stage of capitalism we find ourselves in, which is like nobody on that rig is going to make any more money because they're going faster or whatever. It's for people onshore who own companies, who are shareholders, whatever. And that to me feels very modern, right? This idea of the people who pay the highest cost are never the people who reap the rewards of the kind of system. Those who are profiting are so immunized, they're so protected from any ramifications. But I'm not sort of dragging readers kicking and screaming to that conclusion, right? I want them to arrive to that conclusion themselves. I want them to have to sit with it. And maybe for me, this was the kind of joy of literary fiction, was like trusting the reader, being like, okay, I'm going to present you a story. And like a fable, there's a message here, but you have to do a little bit of work to get there. But that's fun, right?
And that's good literature as well. You need to trust the reader, don't you? And as a reader, you want to be able to work things out for yourself. I wondered if we could go back to the whole kind of male-dominated world thing, because I think it is such a fascinating part of the book and also very revealing of Zainab's character. There's a great quote that I really liked. Handling men was like tending a fire. It required patience, adaptability, and constant attention. Take your eye off the ball and it could all go to shit. And it continues over onto the next page as well, the different kind of approaches and different types of men and how to tend them. Yeah, I just wondered if you could speak to that quote and how that came to you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that passage, actually, because what I tried to do is extend that metaphor and talk about different ways in which you sort of treat fire and the different types of fire there are. And the way that I do think of fire as like it's energy. It's also something that is life-giving, but also can be very destructive. All of these, I think, for Zainab especially, works as a metaphor for her relationship with men and builds on what we were talking about earlier, which is this sense of everything needs a particular strategy. Fire is fire, men are men, but every single context is different. It will never be exactly the same. And you do need to be like vigilant, right? Because you can't always predict how things are going to play out. And so you always have to be responsive. And I suppose a different character might respond to the challenges of an oil rig in a different way. But I also think that for Zainab, who starts working on the rigs in the 80s, who is climbing the ranks in, to the point earlier, in a very physical role, in a place that is built to exclude her, there is no way that she can afford to ask the men to change, right? Because I think sometimes this is part of the question. Like, why can't the system change? Why does Zainab have to change? Why does Zainab have to be doing all of this emotional labor? Why does she have to be the one that's doing all this work? Yeah, sure, in an ideal world, she would be welcomed. And in an ideal world, she would be treated in the way that is best for her. But it's not an ideal world. And she's come into this world, and it's very understood that these are the rules of this world. And if you want to make it in this world, well, you're going to have to play by the rules that everybody else is playing with. And that is particularly hypermasculine. And the reality is not all men are able to stand that world, right?
No.
Not all men are built to withstand the pressures and frankly, the crushing power of patriarchy and that hypermasculinity. It's not actually good for anyone, but that's the culture. And so she's coming into it and she's very much understanding. But to be honest, for Zainab, I think there are flashes. We don't see it very often, but every now and again, she feels like she can have access to the power that particular kind of language of masculinity gives her. There's almost a sense that she's like, well, I'm doing this on my terms. This is a set of terms that I'm choosing. And she revels in that challenge.
Yeah. And she does say at one point, she doesn't even want to change the men. She doesn't want to change things. Actually, she just wants to be able to do her job. And that's the thing that she finds really frustrating, understandably, that she keeps coming up against these blocks. Also, I just thought there, what you said about the sort of danger. Yeah, fire is dangerous. And also there's this sense of danger for her, always, not only being in a really high stakes, high pressurized, dangerous kind of physical environment, but also the sense that she has to be careful with these men because she doesn't know how they might sort of react. I found that interesting. I wanted to ask you, what drew you to it? Like, why did you want to do it? The adventure.
I was just like, get to go to work on a chopper. That's pretty cool. I think I'm very hungry for experiences, right? There was also a practical thing of I was saving up for a master's degree and I wanted to do a master's in motorsport actually here in the UK, and it cost like 50 grand and there was just no way that my family could pay for that. So I needed to find a job that I could save up money. And I thought, oh, well, it sounds like being on a rig would be quite an adventure and I could save up. Win-win. I'm 20 years old. I'm just thinking like job opportunity, great. And everyone that I knew who did engineering worked either adjacent to oil and gas and mining or in oil and gas and mining.
It's where the jobs are, and it's where also it's where the kind of technical kind of interest lies as well, as far as I understand it. Yeah.
So like I used to get asked like, oh, what about the politics? And actually, to be quite honest, when I was at university, we weren't thinking about the politics, which is not great. It's maybe a shame, but that was just so normalized. And so I just thought, oh, this will be quite the adventure. And then I think I got really taken by the technical challenge of it. You know, it's a fascinating, high stakes, very international kind of job. And also I felt for a brief time, I was like, oh, I'm doing something that is, for better or for worse, energy is connected to almost everything. And so I felt this kind of level of, I understood my place in the world, as it were. Obviously, yes, the politics now, it's very highly unlikely that I'd ever work in that industry again. But, you know, my younger brother also studied mechanical engineering. I focused on motorsport. He focused on aerospace. And we were discussing, and I was like, oh, you know, I'm the girl of the Industrial Revolution. He was like, well, you could go into like wind turbines or like electrical vehicles or something. And I was like, but that sounds so boring. And it's terrible. My agent was like, never say this publicly. And I was like, I'm sorry.
Oops,
you know.
One of the things that I found really interesting was the sense of Zainab being an outsider. And as I mentioned before, it's about her kind of sense of frustration. There's a really great quote in which he says, it wasn't about the damn test. It was about whether they listened to her, whether they counted on her as one of them, whether she mattered. Sometimes she thought she did. Then moment came along to remind her exactly how wrong she was. I feel like that is an experience that probably carries across a lot of different walks of life and a lot of people would relate to. I wonder if you would mind talking a little bit about that quote and what you were thinking when you wrote it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally bang on that a lot of people will probably relate to that context. And you're in a meeting and the thing that you're frustrated about isn't even necessarily that big, right? Or that important. You're having an argument about one thing, but really the subtext is, are you listening to me? Do you take me seriously? Do you respect me? Why not? It's like such a deep thing. It's about your worth as a person. It's about your place in that team, in that family, in that relationship. I think it's deeply universal. And for Zainab, all of these kind of thought processes, all of these navigations, all of these dynamics, all of it is in an effort to be listened to be heard, to be valued, to be respected. And it's always a rug pull moment when she's reminded that it isn't. And especially when it comes in in a public manner, especially when it comes in front of other people, it feels so exposing. And I dramatize that in the book, but I think that is such a moment where I've had quite a few readers message and be like, God, I really felt her in that moment. But I also think that is because we know, all of us know what that feels like, to feel that sense of, oh, I've just been shut down in front of a room of my peers or in front of my family or in front of people I care about. And how do you respond to that?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. How do you respond to that? Because she's also sort of shamed into silence. The burn of shame she'd felt, cowering like a kicked puppy. Her skin crawled with the prickling heat of disgrace. It kept her silent. I really related to that somehow. I can think of a couple of examples perhaps, but it's just more this sort of sense of, especially like men having rank or something.
And men do it to each other. I think that shame is a real tool of the patriarchy. That's how you keep people in line. That's how you keep people behaving in a particular way. And I think part of the reason someone like Zainab might not have spoken out was because of the fear of that shame. It's been used by powerful people and by societies and by mobs since time immemorial. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we relate to it and we feel it so deeply, because we're like, oh God, we just know what that's like. And we do a lot to protect ourselves from it, actually. And a lot of the time, part of the reasons we don't speak up is to protect ourselves from that shame.
Oh, absolutely. I actually wanted to move on to ask you a question about your life, if I may. I feel like you experienced something a little bit like this, not public shaming, but I guess sort of a backlash on a really big scale. You experienced being sort of exalted publicly, the Australian of the Year and all this sort of stuff. And then you were also, as you described, you became the most hated Muslim figure in Australia. I was wondering if you could talk about that experience, because I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. And I'm interested in how you go about navigating something like that and still continue to have the courage to speak up. I think it's really admirable.
Well, thank you. I won't go into the details. If people are curious, there's quite a lot online. I often joke that when I meet new people, I'm like, guys, my Wikipedia page is mostly controversies. If that floats your boat, have at it. One of the things that I think a lot of people will be able to relate to or relate to learning, perhaps, was that the shame was not actually mine.
No, exactly.
Like it wasn't my shame.
No.
And I had to, I guess, I don't know if this was something that I had to learn or if it was something that I believed that then allowed me to move through it. But I had to hold on to that and remember that. The shame is not mine. And therefore, I had nothing actually to be ashamed of. And everybody else's reactions were about their own relationships with what was happening, their own relationships with their feelings around power, their feelings around speaking out, their own fears, their own shames. And that took me a long time to have some empathy around, because obviously I might have wanted people to speak out, or I might have wanted things to play out differently. And I've talked in the past about how that sort of sense of the starkest sense that I had at the time was a sense of betrayal, because I thought people, like Zainab in some ways, I thought people would behave differently. And they didn't. And that was disappointing. But also it's clarifying. It's clarifying when people reveal themselves or when people reveal their fears. And it's not that I judge them or think any less of them, but it certainly helps me calibrate my own expectations and figure out, how do I want to live? What's important to me? It preceded my move to the UK. I don't think I would have left Australia any other way. But that's a move that I feel really happy about. I love living in London. I love the kind of work that I get to do in the UK. I write for Emmerdale, which is something that would never have happened, And also I think that I have a really clear sense of my own capacity to move through shame and betrayal and to accept the cost of principle and therefore make clear-eyed judgments around that, if that makes sense.
What would you say to your younger self going through that now with the benefit of hindsight?
Do you know, it's funny. Somebody said to me, look, it'll take 5 to 10 years, but it will blow over. And I remember being like, 10 years? But they were right. And I think it's taken about that amount of time. When you tell a 25-year-old it's going to take 10 years, they're just like, oh my God. Firstly, my thought was like, I'm going to be ancient. Because when you're 25, life ends at 30. But I think I'd probably just reassure her. And I would say that like everything you need, you have. And yes, this is probably like one of the worst experiences you'll ever go through, but you have been forged through this fire and no one will be able to take that away from you. And that's in its own way a gift.
Strength forged through fire. So it sounds like you moved to London. And I mean, writing for Emida, you've done so many extraordinary things. I'm absolutely in awe of just the kind of the versatility of your writing. So you're a published children's author. You've got another one coming out in 2026, which sounds absolutely brilliant. I definitely want to read that. You've just published At Sea. You're a screenwriter. You wrote a memoir. You're obviously incredibly skilled.
At far too young a age.
You've obviously had a lot to say. I feel like you started on the public stage at a very young age. First of all, I was quite interested in what do you think it was that kind of drove you from such a young age to be making things happen and having your voice heard and speaking out and galvanizing people? What is it in you or your experiences that sort of created that?
Oh, Jessie, I'm not sure I've got a very good answer for you because I feel like my answer is I don't really feel I can be any other way. Yeah, for better or for worse. I was saying to someone the other day, like, I never go viral for the things I want to go viral for. I'll say something that I feel like is perfectly normal. And then people go apoplectic. And I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that was a thing that was controversial. I guess here we are now. But I think also maybe something my parents taught me, which is something I'm grateful for, was that they brought me up to have a sense of confidence and a sense of limitlessness. My parents, despite us being first generation migrants from Sudan who came to Australia with like 2 suitcases in their savings kind of thing, my parents never let us think anything wasn't possible. They were always like, oh, whatever it is that you set your heart to, and especially as Muslims, if Allah's got your back, you can do it. Anything is possible. So I think they both were people who moved through the world with a deep sense of agency and a deep sense of possibility. And I think I saw that and I just thought, oh, that's the way to live.
What a gift.
Yeah, really. I feel very grateful for that. Even like my dad's interpretation, whenever there would be an experience of something of discrimination, he'd just be like, I feel so sorry for these people. They don't know how brilliant we are. I think my father is a complicated person and I'm sure it wasn't that straightforward for him. But what he passed on to us certainly meant that I never absorbed the various messages of inferiority that a migrant Sudanese Muslim girl might. I absorbed the message that Allah can make everything possible and you've got a sense of agency, so therefore you can make anything possible. And that also meant that it took me quite a long time to get my head around structural discrimination because there's a lot of like individualism and pull yourself up by your bootstrap kind of philosophy in that as well. So it's not perfect. But I think, to go back to your question about voice, one of the reasons I shifted from engineering was because the company that I was working for at the time was like, you can't be both. You can't be out here like writing. And I ran a youth organization at the time that I'd founded. They were like, you're going to have to choose whether you want to be Yassmin the individual or Yassmin the engineer. You can't be both. And the thought of not being able to speak my mind was intolerable. And so it was never really a question.
You mentioned Sudan there and obviously your heritage. Another one of the not projects that you did, but I guess you could describe it as a kind of role in activism and education, I suppose, as to do with the political situation in Sudan. You started eyesonsudan.net, which is really fascinating. I wanted to ask you, what do you want people in, I guess, the Western world or internationally to understand about Sudan, and what do you want everyone to do?
Oh, thanks for the question, Jessie. I think what I would love people to understand about Sudan and Sudanese people is that while they are currently in the position of being victims of literally the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, I don't see them and they don't see themselves as victims in that purest sense. The Sudanese people are incredible civilians who have like such agency. And I guess I want people to kind of understand that before this war, which is what I would describe a counter-revolutionary war, so a war by belligerent military actors to suppress civilians and to take back kind of control of the state and its resources, there was this incredible revolutionary movement, this incredible non-violent revolutionary movement that overthrew a dictator of 30 years and was in the process of transforming this country into this civilian-led state. And I think it's the kind of movement that is inspiring and should be studied and was like the kind of thing that I'm certain in 20, 30 years' time, people are going to be like, wow, we didn't know that was happening. Like the ways in which people organized on the street, the ways in which they sort of held fast to the rules of nonviolence, to the philosophy of nonviolence, the ways in which the young people flourished and they set up this incredible sit-in, almost like Occupy Wall Street, where they created this new little world where people were giving out healthcare and education, and there was music and there was an art and there's a flourishing of creative output that's stunning. So I guess I'd want people to be curious about Sudanese people outside the context of just this conflict, because so often I think Sudan is seen solely through that lens. And yes, this is such a terrible war, but we are more than the war. And I'd encourage people to, whether it's watch a Sudanese film or read a book or like a novel or listen to some Sudanese rap, which is really popping off at the moment.
Wow. I'd love a recommendation,
yeah.
actually.
Yeah. Well, okay. So if you want like an old school classic novel, Seasons of Migration to the North by Tayyip Saleh, I think it was voted like one of the best 100 novels by Arab-speaking authors of the last century or something. It's a very kind of classic text. But if you want something more modern, historical fiction called River Spirits by Layla Abu Layla, who's a Sudanese woman who lives in Aberdeen. And she's an incredible writer. All of her work is fascinating, but River Spirit is her most recent novel. And it's a really wonderful historical fiction about the last time there was war in Sudan. It's sort of a fictionalized version of the death of General Gordon, which happened in Khartoum, in the capital. So there's a couple of books there. There's a really wonderful film called Goodbye Julia by a Sudanese director, creative person who started out as an engineer. So Goodbye Julia is brilliant. And there's another one called Cotton Queen, which is coming out shortly, that is set more in a village context. And then if you go on something like Spotify and look up the playlist Sudan rap or Sudan music, the playlist is actually pretty decent. So
I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
I think what you were talking about just then was essentially seeing a nation, seeing a country, seeing a people in all their humanity and all their complexity, and not just reducing people down to stereotypes. And I think that's what you do so well, it seems, across all of your work, whether that's been writing or the kind of advocacy that you do and the activism, because throughout At Sea, for example, you're peppering the text with Arabic words or allowing an outsider to see through the eyes of a Muslim woman. Yeah, I feel like you do that so effectively. So we're coming very much to the end. I could talk to you all day, but I just wanted to ask you a couple of really quick questions that I often ask people. So the first one is, what advice have you got to a woman who is looking to find her voice?
My first instinct, or the first thing that came to mind, was to trust yourself. I think so often, for me, it's less about finding something that isn't there and more about reaccessing something that maybe has been suppressed or pushed down. Your voice isn't something that's lost in a cupboard that you need to find. It's about something that's always been in you, and moving towards trusting that and moving towards giving yourself permission and differentiating between the things that people have told you that are actually not serving you at all and what you actually deep down know to be true.
That's a good answer. And what would you say to them if they were afraid to put their head above the parapet or stand up and say something? Because it feels like at this time, especially, that misogyny online and the voices can be really loud against women who use their voice. What would you say to them to encourage them about courage?
I'm not going to lie to you and tell you there's no cost for speaking up, right? I'm not going to say that it is necessarily easy, but I think it's almost always worth it. I think maybe the philosophy I would use to approach it is pick your battles. What really matters to you? And when you find the thing that really matters to you, whether it's a small thing or a big thing, the cost will be worth it. And so maybe it's about preparing yourself for that, surrounding yourself with people that understand why you're choosing to stand up for that particular thing, but also understanding maybe at some level that even if you are the only person standing up and saying a particular thing, as Zainab was in the novel, as I have been many times in my life, the thing that keeps me warm at night is knowing that I stood by my principles, or knowing that I was true to myself. And that's what really matters for me. People are fickle. The public is fickle. People forget things, and time will always pass. The feeling will pass, the feeling of shame, the feeling of betrayal. You can move through it, but you have to live with yourself. And I know for myself, the thing that matters to me is knowing I did what was true and important for me, and that always feels enough.
Who's your favourite female writer of all time?
Oh, my favorite female writer of all time. Very challenging question, Jessie. Layla Abul-Ala, who wrote River Spirit, is one of my favorite writers. I think she also writes about Sudanese women in a way that nobody else is doing in the English language. But Brotherless Night is a novel that won the Women's Prize a couple of years ago, and I'm forgetting the author's name, so I apologize, but you can look it up. It's brilliant. It's the kind of book that I wish I could write a version of, and maybe in 30 years I'll try. But it's essentially the story of a woman and her brothers, but it's actually a story about the Sri Lankan war and genocide told through this woman's life and her relationship with her siblings. And it's just stunning.
Check that one out.
Definitely check it out.
And lastly, what's the hill you'd die on?
What's the hill I die on? Does it have to be an important hill or a...
No,
or
it can just be anything. It could be a fun hill if there is one.
Yes. Okay. The hill that I will die on is... maybe fittingly, I will always love the petrol car. I'm sorry. Electric cars are just not the same. You might as well be on a scooter.
Love it. There's something really profound and, as Yassmin says, deeply relevant to our times. This whole idea around sensing impending disaster but not being able to stop it. When I was reading at sea, I couldn't help thinking of Cassandra, fated to see the future but never to be believed. Her voice, every attempt, falling on deaf ears. I think a lot of people could probably relate to that feeling right now, with our world on fire in its various ways. I really like what Yassmin said about speaking up. Throughout her life, she's continually spoken out for what she believes in. I think it's inspiring and amazing, really, that despite everything she's experienced, she still believes it almost always worth it. She paid a high price for using her voice at one time in her life, but continues to do so to great effect. Maybe it's not really a choice, but just integral to who she is. When she was faced with a choice, she chose expression. It was a no-brainer, as anything else would be, in her words, intolerable. I love talking to Yassmin, and I hope you enjoyed this episode too. If you enjoyed this episode, do follow the podcast, leave a review or share it with someone who loves storytelling or complicated women. It really helps an independent podcast like this one. And if you'd like more conversations like this, along with behind-the-scenes reflections and thoughts on books, creativity and voice, you can join the How You Find Your Voice Substack. It's a new space to go a little deeper into the ideas, books and conversations that sit behind this project. I'd love to see you there. The link's in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Until next time.